to be moderating this important discussion as those of us in the US and other parts of the world celebrate Pride Month to recognize the resilience and determination and impact of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals. For LGBTQ identifying professionals, global development can bring unique risks, challenges, and opportunities. So building inclusive workplaces is critical for organizations to support this community and their staff. It is also so important in ensuring the rights and needs of LGBTQ plus individuals and communities are taken into account when designing and delivering aid programs and achieving progress on the SDGs. So today I will speak with several experts working on just that from a variety of perspectives. We will talk to Clifton Cortez, the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Global Advisor at the World Bank Group, and Gurjatan Sandhu, President of UN Globe, the group representing LGBTIQ plus staff in the UN system. But first, I am delighted to be joined by Victor Madrigal-Borlos, the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Victor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I believe in 2018, you became the second person to assume this post with the UN. It sounds like a big mandate for one person. So can you talk a little bit about why this role was created and what has been your focus the past few years?
The mandate was created by the Human Rights Council as the result of the evidence that was provided in two reports prepared by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Those reports were prepared in 2011 and 2015. And in fact, they documented a very worrisome situation of violence and discrimination against persons because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, real or perceived. And I believe that the creation of the mandate, which was contentious and the object of 5 votes across the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, nonetheless constituted an acceptance of the fact that violence and discrimination analysis requires taking also the point of entry of sexual orientation and gender identity if one is seriously going to tackle the work of dismantling the structures that perpetuate stigma. And over the 4 and some years that the mandate has existed, the first mandate holder, Vitit Muntaphorn, and myself, we have made it our mission to provide evidence of the way in which violence and discrimination manifests itself in the everyday lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons, but also to identify good and best practice that can be adopted by state and non-state actors to ensure that such violence and discrimination are addressed and will eventually be eradicated.
Yeah, so I mean, you state how there was even contention around this, with attitudes towards the LGBTQ community really varying across the world, including criminalization even in some member states. I can imagine some of the challenges you've faced. So how have you seen some of the attitudes change within the UN system, with member states, towards recognizing this importance? And what approaches have you found successful in driving that change?
Well, Kate, what you can undoubtedly imagine is that this mandate covers the widest fan of opinions in relation to the way in which a society deals with sexual orientation and gender identity. I've documented how in some contexts there's plain denial of the existence, the very existence of LGBT persons within the jurisdiction of the state. And this type of argument was what very much was at the base of some of those discussions when the mandate was created. Some states actually argued that LGBT people didn't exist in their jurisdiction and that they were a creation of the global north or the global west. Other states that do not deny the existence of LGBT people still, however, see their very lives and their very existences as antisocial. And these are undoubtedly the 69 states that still maintain criminalization. Let's not forget that 9 of them punish with the death penalty and 5 apply it regularly. That means that as of today, some 2 billion people live in the world in criminalized environments, which of course carves deep grooves in the social mores and the understanding of LGBT lives. And then in contexts where you don't have criminalization, you still have those remnants of pathologization, of criminalization, of even demonization that perpetuate stigma and consciously or unconsciously associate the existence of LGBT people with antisocial behavior or behavior that is somewhat against the good interest of society. Faced with this reality, I think that what works best is the evidence-based approach. To dismantle stigma, to dismantle preconception, what I believe you need is to provide evidence about how, first of all, sexual orientation and gender identity are part of human diversity, and that every element of proof and evidence that we have shows that they have existed all throughout history, in all cultures, in all corners of the world, and are therefore to be seen as part and inherent to human existence. And how societies that actually embrace diversity benefit substantially, not only from the fact that they know their populations better and are therefore able to formulate better and more adequate public policy in all realms, health, education, employment, but also to the effect that they are able to benefit from the wealth of contributions that are given by people who live free and equal in their societies.
Yeah, and so in your work, where have you found the most gains? Is it trying to work with through the political or even legislative policy process, or working with communities, civil society, private sector? Where has been in your focus and you've seen the most success?
I think the winning formula is that actually has inclusion as the very core. I always say to my interlocutors that whenever I organize a meeting or a consultation, I always ask myself, who am I leaving out? And because of that approach, when I work in a particular setting, I am, of course, taking the state institutions as point of entry, the judiciary, the executive, and the parliamentary. But I know that it's impossible to have a full, objective, and comprehensive picture if I am not acknowledging the input of civil society and also of people with lived experiences and other forces of society, including business and media and even religious organizations. All of these institutions, in fact, have a role to play in addressing and deconstructing stigma and preconception. Let me give you an example. I was just in a country visit to Tunisia, a country, the context of which has enormous promise for addressing discrimination, and that has gone a very, very interesting process since the revolution some 10 years ago. In that equation, understanding how civil society is positioning itself, but also how religious discourse interacts with violence and discrimination, how LGBT people are portrayed in the media, what type of portrayals are those, whether they're positive or negative, and even how is business embracing models of diversity, is the only way to really create a comprehensive overview of the way violence and discrimination occurs in a context.
Yeah, so we'll be speaking in a bit with Gurjatan Sandhu, who's the president of UN Globe, representing LGBTQ staff within the UN system. What work have you seen happen to support the LGBTQ community within the UN? And then how is this important to the work that you do externally?
Well, there's a number of very important connections with the analysis that takes point of departure in discrimination and violence, and particularly on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the fundamental pillars of work of the United Nations. I can give you a main example, and that is the Development Agenda. As you know, the United Nations Development Agenda is driven by the Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals are actually surrounding certain social indicators for progress. In my view, the performance of those indicators, of course, also covers LGBT people as other persons historically subjected to discrimination. These persons usually show the poorest performance in all of these indicators. And so my point in relation to this is the better you can know the LGBT population in a context, the better you can understand how to formulate effective and pertinent policy in relation to health, thus connecting with Sustainable Development Goal 3, housing, education, employment, and so on and so forth. You can actually build an understanding of those who you are mandated not to leave behind, but taking point of departure the particular determinants that place them at a situation of disadvantage. This is my worry about criminalization, for example, because it leads me to ask countries in which criminalization exists, how are you asking people who they live with or what their health concerns are when revealing this information is tantamount to self-incrimination? And how are you going to then be able to bring those lived realities into the formulation of your knowledge base upon which you're going to do your development policy? So it all is a cycle of knowing the realities in which populations actually undergo determinants for discrimination and disadvantage or experience of privilege. There are significant connections with the UN-wide agenda in all of this thinking about eradicating discrimination. And since you're going to be talking to Cliff Cortez from the World Bank, you'll see that my work actually very much synchronizes with the Social Inclusion Index that is being developed by agencies such as the UNDP and the World Bank in trying to understand how the work of social inclusion interacts with progress towards the SDGs and other areas. Finally, one of the very specific points of connection is ensuring also that UN staff, the staff in the UN family, also are able to live free and equal. And this is why it's of fundamental importance that you're going to be talking to the UN Globe. They carry out an incomparable and exemplary work of ensuring that UN staff all around the world are able to avail themselves of instruments that will protect them also from discrimination, but also not only enable them to live free and equal, but also to provide examples and to, as one says, to walk the talk when it comes to United Nations interaction with governments all over the globe.
Yeah, definitely. So, we know the transgender community, particularly trans women, even more specifically, Black transgender women in the US are perhaps one of the most at-risk populations, here where I'm based in the US, have an average lifespan of just 35 years, a really sobering statistic. I'm actually the mother of a transgender son, and we've seen an onslaught of bills and legislation targeting trans youth in the US this year that has been pretty horrifying to our family. And so what work are you seeing being done to support trans people on a global scale? And is there room for optimism, despite a lot of what we've seen being covered in the media?
Well, Kate, what I can share with you is that this year I've been doing my research around the reception of gender-based approaches in international human rights law and the meaning of this incorporation for basically discrimination theory. I think that there needs to be an understanding that all gender-based approaches, insofar as they acknowledge that gender preconceptions and stereotypes are social constructs, they actually reveal themselves in the work concerning gender identity and the lives of trans people, who are usually the most evident challenging of gender norms in any context, in any gendered society, which is tantamount to say in any society around the world. And throughout this research, I've developed a number of conclusions. One of them is that we all have an interaction with gender stereotypes. We all take decisions in the way that we actually accept or challenge gender preconceptions, and in the way we manifest externally in the world those gender preconceptions. And that is part of the identity that we all have. So I think one of the notions that we need to dismantle is not only trans people have gender identity, we all have some form of gender identity, because we all have a relationship with the preconceptions of gender that surround us. And in that sense, the protection of people from discrimination based on gender identity is a quintessential human endeavor, and not necessarily only reflected in a particular part of the population. Second element is there is an inextricable relation between the existence of trans persons and the full enjoyment of their rights, and the furtherance of agendas of enjoyment of all humans, including all women, of freedom from violence and discrimination. And in that sense, the existence of trans persons actually relates very strongly to the agendas of bodily autonomy and comprehensive sexual and gender education. And Kate, I think that this is the reason why trans people are being targeted, is because their existence is, I've come to describe it in this way, at the forefront of those very fundamental struggles, those very fundamental culture wars that have as ultimate objective the control on sexual and reproductive rights, which, as you know, has been the main driver for all feminist thinking over the last 40 years. So it is a fundamental challenge to the way our societies and power is structured. I also believe that conservative and radical conservative agendas have seen in trans persons an easy target that instrumentalizes their existence and somehow are galvanizing conservative discourses in many countries around the world, capitalizing on preconception and stigma about their existence rather than evidence. And this is why, Kate, I go back to the importance of an evidence-based approach that really questions how many cases are behind that legislation that is being adopted, and if at all there was ever that alleged contradiction between rights that is being allegedly solved by those legislations. I believe that it's important to have those conversations, but that it's also important to have them on the basis of well-researched scientific evidence rather than preconception and stigma.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. You know, we even gotten some angry messages from our audience that we're even hosting this event, presuming that we are putting the rights of LGBT communities above others, when I think your point is so important. You know, trans rights, LGBT rights are human rights, and we're kind of all in this together. What advice, in closing, would you have for global development professionals who want to ensure the needs of LGBTQ communities are taken into consideration in their work? Any piece of advice or even resources to recommend?
Yes, I actually had a significant opportunity to think about approaches for mainstreaming the concerns of persons affected by violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, while thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on these populations and communities. And I came up with an instrument that I'd like to share with your audience, which is the Aspire guidelines. You will be able to find them in my webpage at the United Nations. It's very easy to get there. You just type Independent Expert SOGI and you'll immediately get there. We may even be able to share that page in this chat. Aspire stands for, it's an acronym standing for 6 basic principles when designing response and recovery from different emergency or development approaches. And it stands for acknowledge the existence of LGBT persons, support LGBT serving and LGBT-led organizations, protect LGBT persons from discrimination and violence. Indirect discrimination is a real risk, and you need to bring it into your risk management approaches. Representation is key. People need a place at the table in furtherance of the principle of nothing about us without us, for a very real reason. It's the only way to make public policy that actually will be effective and efficacious. And finally, evidence-based approaches are fundamental to dismantle prejudice. Aspire is what actually comes if you put all of that together. And the idea when I formulated that approach is that we were very much aspiring to a COVID-19 response and recovery that would be free from violence and discrimination. But I've come to think that it's a good checklist for anybody who's actually designing responses or programming in the context of needing to address the needs of these populations and communities.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, we'll definitely share those resources in the chat for everyone today. Well, thank you so much, Victor, for taking the time to be with us. I know you're very busy doing really important work, so really appreciate all that you do and for sharing a few minutes with us today. So thank you.
It's my pleasure, and I thank you very much for your support to the mandate. Have a lovely session. I really wish you the best.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. So now I'd like to welcome our next guest, Clifton Cortez, the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Global Advisor at the World Bank Group, and Gurjatan Sandhu, President of UN Globe. So thank you both for being here today. Great. Good to see you both. So, really interesting conversation just had with Victor. Clifton, I wanted to start with you. It's kind of similar question I posed to him. I believe you are the first person to hold the SOGI Global Advisor position at the World Bank. So what led to this position being created, and what has really been your focus the past, I guess, some 5 years since you've been in this role?
Sure. In terms of, thank you for that question, Kate. What led to the creation of the position was really the evolution of our understanding as a global community of the importance of inclusion for economic and social development. And that inclusion means inclusion for everybody, not just some folks. And that also means for sexual and gender minorities or LGBTQ people. And there was pressure within the bank, both from our executive board and leadership of the bank. There was pressure from outside the bank, particularly from LGBTQ civil society, to take this on. And this was happening at the same time that the bank was adopting it, or the executive board was debating and then ultimately adopting new rules of the bank going forward, associated with all of our loans to governments, to clients of the bank. And I'll talk a little later about some of the important elements of that. But LGBTQ people and inclusion was an important part of that conversation. And then in terms of what we've been doing since they created my position and I moved over to the bank from the UN, I used to be at UNDP, and before that at USAID. Well, since I've been there, we've been defining the agenda within the bank with clients and with others. And we've really figured out that the important ways of moving this ahead are, one, focusing on the environmental and social framework, those rules of the bank, how we engage with clients in the loan process and in project implementation. Also in capacity building for bank staff and also for our clients, the governments, who are the managers of these projects once they take resources from the bank. And finally, really looking inward also, how we treat each other in terms of fairness and equality in the bank and the institution.
Right, yeah, and Victor had mentioned a social inclusion index that you all worked on. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, actually. So the LGBTI Inclusion Index is a UNDP initiative, but they partnered with the bank partnered with UNDP a couple of years back, and we led a global consultative process to better understand what inclusion really looks like and what the priorities should be when it across education, across health, across governance, across issues like addressing violence, one of the important issues that Victor focused on in his remarks. And we ultimately produced through this consultative process that involved academics, that involved LGBTI civil society, private sector, some SOGI-friendly governments, the UN agencies, et cetera. We produced 51 indicators that we could use for measuring in any kind of program LGBTI inclusion across 5 sectors or issue areas in development. And so that's what those are. And they can really be useful for guiding questions for organizations in terms of how we look at this in terms of our own work, our own priorities, our own projects.
Great, thank you. And Gurchatun, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Thank you for joining us. So UN Globe is a group representing LGBTIQ staff across the UN. Can you share a bit more about your mission and your work and what you are focused on?
Well, let me start off by saying thank you very much for inviting UN Globe to be here and for me to represent UN Globe. It's an honor and privilege to be amongst great panelists today. What UN Globe, let me just start with what does GLOBE stand for. Well, when GLOBE was created, it stood for gay, lesbian or bisexual employees. Now we cover a more diverse personnel with more diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expressions and sex characteristics. So now we cover LGBTIQ+. GLOBE came about at a time back in 1997 when within the UN system, and we were just a little bit younger than World Bank Globe, because there's our sisters or siblings in World Bank as well. So we're a little bit younger, and we came around 1997 more from a need for information exchange. There was being progress made across the globe on LGBTIQ+ issues. But needless to say, within the UN system, there wasn't a lot of information. Questions arose around, well, where is it safe for me to go as an LGBTIQ+ person? Can I register my same-sex or same-gendered partnership? What are my entitlements and benefits? I'm facing homophobia or biphobia, transphobia within the workplace due to my perceived sexual orientation or real sexual orientation. So there were questions around that. What UN Globe, when UN Globe came together, was a need for information exchange. So a group of 5 women in particular came together and advocated for a group to be set up, and the then Secretary General allowed for UN Globe to be set up under the premise of the Office of Human Resources. Since then, UN Globe's mandate has somewhat changed and evolved to be more of an advocacy, more like a staff union or a staff council per se, representing LGBTIQ+ personnel and dependents. So we say personnel because we cover JPOs or junior professional officers, YPPs, interns and consultants, often because you're going to find LGBTIQ+ people in the most precarious forms of work. And, sadly, it's the case with interns and consultants. And we also cover dependents, because what we're now seeing is more and more personnel from the UN reaching out to saying, well, I have a dependent, I have a child who's LGBTIQ+, can you help? Can you give me some guidance? Where is it safe? So, our mandate has grown, and we have become more of a council in terms of, we have 3 goals, and we want to change the conversation around sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression and sex characteristics in the UN system, especially around 3 goals. One is better and more inclusive employment conditions. So here we're talking about policies such as mobility, parental leave, gender identity markers, inclusive communication. So, making sure that LGBTIQ plus issues are, transversal and embedded across all HR rules and procedures and staff policies. Then we come to more diverse and inclusive workplaces and workplaces. So here we're talking about safety and security. Safety and security procedures, making sure that LGBTIQ plus issues are embedded into harassment or discrimination policies, safety and security procedures, safety and security training as well, such as deployment. What issues will an LGBTIQ plus person face when in a duty station that criminalizes, in a country that criminalizes LGBTIQ plus persons. And the second part of the safety and security pillar is better mental health and well-being, and culture as well, and training. So here we're looking at, integrating LGBTIQ concerns into health policies. For example, we're working with the mental health strategy team, and also, looking at training colleagues and making training more mandatory for every member of staff and personnel on LGBTIQ plus issues. And then lastly, our third pillar is nothing about us, without us. We want to ensure, like Victor said, that our voices are in the room when HR policies or any procedures that impact or could potentially impact personnel, we're there to ensure that LGBTIQ plus voices are there, heard, and concerns are listened to. It's very, very important, because more often than not, we're an add-on. We don't want to be an add-on. We want to be in that room, at that table, representing those voices of our membership. Thank you.
Yeah, those are some great points. And so Clifton, I'd love to hear from your perspective how the work of groups like UN Globe, and I believe World Bank also has a Globe, similar type of entity, how that is important in reinforcing the work you're doing at the bank in an external nature, and how you see those two going hand in hand.
Thank you for that. I think there's two pieces of that. On the one hand, Globe, World Bank Globe, which is really quite active as well, just like UN Globe, with our membership, and then in the broader bank. It's one of the handful of officially recognized employee resource groups in the bank. And UN Globe works on a number of different issues, and some of those are specific to internal policies and the benefits that we as bank staff are entitled to, and ensuring there's equality there, regardless of who you are when it comes to your sexual orientation or gender identity. But then also importantly, Globe has for a long time also put a focus on advocating within the institution on these very issues, that we need to have a perspective on operations, the work of the bank in the world, in terms of how we're impacting in a positive way LGBTIQ people, how we're trying to help ensure inclusion of LGBTIQ people in development in their countries. So Globe has that voice as well in terms of the internal advocacy around these issues, because the Globe folks are the staff and they know our work as the bank. The other piece of that is that really Globe's push with our Human Resources Vice Presidency on the issue of policies and fairness and equality and how we treat each other in the workplace. And that involves a number of things, including the ones that our colleague from UN Globe was just mentioning, like issues of workplace harassment, issues of discrimination, and stigma, and realized stigma in the workplace. So all these things go hand in hand, how we treat each other in the work that we do, and then also how do we translate that into the work that our institutions are expected to do in the world, helping member state countries in the case of the UN, helping client member states in the case of the World Bank. Those are one and the same. And we're all contributing to the same thing. We're all intended to be helping governments achieve their development frameworks, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's how these things work together. And that's how Globe and the World Bank plays a part of that.
Yeah, so Victor mentioned the importance of evidence-based approaches. What have you found successful in working with member states, other counterparts, your own staff, in and helping to push this agenda further?
Yeah, I'm glad you said you noted that. And I also noted that one of the questions in the chat already has to do with some skepticism from somebody about this very issue of building the evidence base and how much the evidence base or data really drives policy or really drives changes in attitudes, is really, I think, what they focused on in the question in the chat. And that is a really important part of the bank's agenda on SOGI inclusion. And it is that research and that generation of data with clients. And new analytics with clients that is LGBTIQ specific, SOGI specific. I didn't mention it before because I knew we were coming to it here, and it deserves its own special focus. It's true that some clients won't move on policy only because of data on this issue. That's true. However, that's not all clients. Many clients are open to the discussion and will only be convinced if we bring data to the table. This is what exclusion in education looks like for queer people. This is what exclusion in health services and the COVID response looks like for LGBTIQ people. That's the sort of data and analytics that can change policy, that underlies whether we're included or not in a given country. And so we need to focus on where we can move things and continue to push with those governments, those clients of the bank, where it may take more than just the data to change. And that means it goes beyond an institution like the bank and other partners who are working with the government and civil society in the country on the data that's specific to development outcomes, and really is also a focus on getting people more familiar with who we are, the fact that we are all around them, the fact that practically no family will be without somebody who is diverse when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, to recognize these things and familiarity over time, understanding what this means for people you know, not just amorphous people out there in the media or in the stratosphere, that can begin to change attitudes. We know because we've seen it in places. Does that mean it's going to be the same everywhere or easier, not easier in some places than others? Absolutely not. It's going to be harder in some places, and all the more reason why we have to stay in the game.
Yeah, and so Gurchathan, you had mentioned some of the challenges that your members face, be it being assigned to a duty station where maybe homosexuality is criminalized, worrying about benefits for spouses. What are some of the biggest challenges your LGBTIQ staff within the immune system face, and what are some of the best practices that you might be able to share for creating inclusive and safe workplaces for your members that maybe some of our listeners can take back into their organizations?
Well, I think, where do we start? The UN's made a lot of progress in terms, and the UN system has. I think notably when it comes to recognition of personal status, we moved from a nationality approach, where if your government recognizes your partnership, we will recognize it too, to regardless of the nationality, based on a jurisdiction approach, we will recognize your partnership. Great. Then we achieved and secured same-sex or survivor rights. Fantastic. However, on the backs of that, there are still, what we're still getting is stories or issues of staff or personnel not registering their partners with the UN system or with their employers, with their different entities, because that information, when it's recorded in the system, is accessible to different colleagues. And they're concerned that information, one, is shared with colleagues who will then perhaps use that information and weaponize it and then share it with with their national governments. And that can have very serious consequences for that individual, and often being evacuated out, and if they don't even have the choice of being evacuated out, their life isn't, their security is in jeopardy. And so that's a big issue. And then, is the information then being shared with my own government, or with, I've registered my partnership, but then is that data now being shared with a host government or a government that I'm a national of, that is not friendly to LGBTIQ plus persons? So some of the challenges there. So progress made, problems on that still. Then we see around parental leave. Parental leave is one of the biggest issues that a lot of LGBTIQ plus persons, wanting to conceive, have families. So the current model in the UN system is that, it favors one type of family, the one that is conceived through biologically, and that family is favored over other families through surrogacy and adoption. And it doesn't matter if you're an LGBTIQ plus family or a heterosexual couple, children conceived naturally versus children, through adoption and surrogacy. So we need to change that. We are slowly seeing a trend towards that, where we're seeing more parental inclusive family policies. WHO, IOM, UNICEF, UNHCR, they're beginning to adopt more family-friendly, inclusive parental leave policies. We know that discussions are now actually taking place at the International Civil Service Commission on this, and hopefully we want to see a positive outcome. But, what we tend to see is a lot of agencies say, well, what are they doing? What is that entity doing? What is that UN entity doing? We don't, there's a reluctancy always to be the first, and we want to see leaders, and we have to praise those who actually stick their necks out and are the first. But we also have to recognize that there are some agencies that have to go, or entities that have to go through their own, governing body procedures, that they have their own sort of, especially the specialized agencies. So that's those issues there. And then when we have the issues of mobility, the classification of family duty stations still remains a big challenge. A family for whom? Some definitions of family do not necessarily apply to my definition of family. And consequently, even myself, that, I've had to turn down positions because they're in a duty station where, being LGBTIQ plus is criminalized, and it could be potentially a threat for me. Or I can't take my partner there because they can't get a visa. And that often means missing out on career opportunities. But we're only looking at one side of the picture here. Everything that often applies to, a professional category of staff. We've now got to really focus on national staff as well as consultants and interns and the challenges that they face too. So, it's very important for us, even within UN Globe, that we look at our infrastructure, that UN Globe is actually walking the talk as well, and how diverse is UN Globe in itself. And I will talk about this later when it comes to intersectionalities as well. So I think that's one of the key things as well. In terms of challenges, I think the biggest challenge is then also for UN Globe in itself, resources. We're, often seen as an employee resource group, but we don't even have resources of our own. So we have to fundraise. We're doing this on a voluntary basis. We want to actually see that this is officially recognized by our member states, by our employers, and that we're given time, that our network of guild coordinators is given time to do the very important work that we do, and we have the right right resources behind us, and that means time as well. Because I think when it comes down to it, we're providing an essential service for our employers. We're bringing those voices to the table. So yeah, I think there's still a lot more to do. I even forgot to mention that the work on gender identity and we're still having challenges where we hear from potential candidates saying, look, there's only 2 markers on the form and it still says male and female. What can I do? And is it even safe for me to share that information? And we hear horror stories of where candidates turn up for interviews and their gender identity does not align with their gender markers that they've reported on the forms, and they've been they've had negative, if not horrific, experiences during the interview process, where the focus has not been on their skills but on their gender identity. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But progress is being nevertheless made.
Yeah, I think so. We had a question from the audience, and for anyone listening, and if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and we'll try to get to some that gets to kind of that data question. And a lot of the data we capture is very disaggregated between male, female. A lot of funders track their data that way. And then running up against another question somebody asked around, expanding inclusion of the trans community, butting up against the notion of taking away the work towards women's empowerment. And actually, we had a case of this about exactly a year ago. Devex published an op-ed. It was around menstrual hygiene, and the headline described people who menstruate. You may have seen this when famous author J.K. Rowling tweeted that and took issues with that term that spiraled out of control. Actually, is the most read article on Devex ever for not the reasons we wanted. Really missing the point of the article, that you have to be inclusive of understanding that not just women menstruate if you want to have effective programs and policies. But there is that notion out there that it could be taking away the work of women's advancement to include trans communities, and also how you capture that data. So Cliff, I don't know if you have thoughts on this, or this is something that you deal with or think about at the bank, but any insight on how you view that challenge?
So I'll take on both of those questions briefly. The first being the issue of how we collect data when it comes to people who are gender diverse. The US government, starting in the Obama administration, had a working group I think it was led by Census Bureau, US Census, in which they really hashed out this issue of how best to ask this question when you're doing surveys of different kinds of research on, and get at sexual orientation and get at issues of gender identity in a way that's useful for the collection of data. And of course, in all these things, always needing to keep in mind the safety, security, confidentiality of the people who are providing this information. This is true in any data gathering exercise, especially an acute issue when it comes to sexual and gender minorities. But the US government's not the only one who delved into this question. The Australian government and others have done similar. And so the bank has pulled together some of that work that's been done, and we're using it for our own internal discussions for how we want to go forward in collecting data on these issues. We've been collecting data on these issues for about the last 5 years or so in some specific data generation research efforts. And that will be refined every time we have a new research effort, including to get at these kind of key issues. The issue of gender, traditionally understood as women and girls in terms of the binary, so men and boys and women and girls, and the challenges we face around that and the limitations of it when it comes to gender diversity, the reality of gender diversity in the world. And this is not specifically about the bank. It's more about my just reflecting on my work in now 3 different large development bureaucracies, institutions that are trying to support civil society and governments in the efforts to change our world around these things. And my reflection is that a really serious problem is the fact that after 50, 60 years of efforts to address gender inequality in the world, more broadly, serious efforts of moving this issue as exclusion. Gender isn't exclusion. It's an exclusion for lots of things, including one's economic outlook, what you can expect to get or to achieve when it comes to your economic productivity and your development outcomes throughout the course of your life. And women and girls have borne the brunt of that exclusion when it comes to that gender, the binary approach, and the exclusion that has stemmed from it historically. And we can't ignore that. And that's an element, an ingredient that's a part of this conversation. So we need to acknowledge that and acknowledge that all of us need to do better at that for women and girls, but we also need to be able to do better at that for trans people, for trans youth, for trans kids. We also need to do better at that for all of us. And this goes to Victor's earlier comments about how we all make decisions about how we're going to both present ourselves and how we're going to go about certain things that are often grounded in our accepted notions of what gender is and what gender expression is. So we have a long way to go. And I would say the important thing is that we need to try to find those areas of agreement to push forward alliances with women's movements and other rights movements if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve when it comes to equality and rights for LGBTIQ plus people. We're not going to be able to do it on our own, and we're absolutely not going to be able to do it without the women's movement, without the power of women activists who are pushing this gender issue and gender exclusion, challenging gender exclusion. We're going to continue to have challenges from some of those activists who are very good activists at addressing the issue of the binary of gender and exclusion, and who don't yet accept, for various reasons, the idea of gender diversity or the legitimacy or the equality inherent in somebody who might be different from you when it comes to gender, as a woman as much as a man. And so we're going to have that, and we're going to have to keep pushing forward on that. But I think the approach I would always take is we can't be deciding that certain people aren't quite as equal as others, and this is why. We shouldn't do it on race. We shouldn't do it on religion. And we shouldn't do it on relative to persons with disabilities versus people who don't have disabilities. And we certainly shouldn't be doing it when it comes to gender diversity.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. And I think that gets into a topic I want to touch on around intersectionality too. And Gurchattan, I would love to hear I know you have a very diverse group, and probably with identities that are layered upon on top of the LGBTIQ identity. So maybe can you talk a little bit about that and why it's important to have an intersectional lens be applied to supporting these communities?
Well, I mean, for us, I think there's a tendency just to see, LGBTIQ plus people in sort of silos and forget about other aspects of ourselves. And I mean, for us, going to answer this from two perspectives internally within UN Globe. We have a network of coordinators, which is, predominantly, 90% white, North American, European, male, cis, LGBTIQ plus men. And there's very few people and they mostly fall into the professional category. We have, in the UN system, we have, P's, G's, and then we have national category. So we've got to start walking the talk, because it's very important that, that all voices are in the room and all voices are being heard. And for us, the most marginalized voices will lift us all up. Let's go back to the Stonewall riots, just as an example. It was, it was Marsha P. Johnson, that lifted up a whole community for us. And the same within the UN system. It's the most marginalized voices that are within the UN system, or not even within the UN system, that can actually help us become more and more diverse and more inclusive. So for us, even within our network, we need to improve on that as well. So, one of the things that we've been doing within UN Globe is, okay, how do we have eligibility criteria in our coordinators, which says, okay, we want more diversity, and how do we identify those barriers as well to inclusion? For example, the premise of even being a coordinator or being a representative of the LGBTI community is that you are out. You are visible. Not many people can do that, especially if you're a national working or living in a country where being LGBTIQ+ is criminalized. So then the onus falls on us, or myself and the board, to identify one of those barriers and then remove those barriers and make it so that we create safe space for those voices to come forward. So for us, it shouldn't be being out shouldn't be a prerequisite to serve your community. So what we've done is that, in our eligibility forms, we've, said, look, we want, different members of the sexual, different coordinators from different sexual orientations, different gender identities, different professional categories, ethnicities, regional representation, and different contract types as well, because often we only see, the fixed terms. One of those voices of consultants and interns are sort of pushed to the back, and often the most neglected and discriminated against. So it's very important for us to have that intersectional lens within UN Globe, because we've got to walk the talk. And frankly, we're not doing, we can do more. And it's not, for me, on a personal level, it's not happening fast enough. Within UN Globe, there's only 3 or 4 people of color, even within our network of coordinators, and we need to do better, So that's internally. Then it's externally, for us, it's very important that we have an intersectional lens, thanks to the Assistant Secretary General's office in the Secretariat, we were able to partake in the discussions around racism, on racism within the UN, on the SG's working group there. We look forward to being part of other discussions as well. And in fact, we ask to be invited to those discussions, because we know that, that LGBTIQ plus voices are not just sort of in silos. They're intersecting with different identities. So for us, I think intersectionality is at the key of the heart of the work that we do. So for us, we welcome those opportunities to be engaging with different parts of the UN, and we're working with the UN PAD, with the People of African Descent group. We're happy to sort of support Young UN, happy to support people, our colleagues who are now sort of putting together a group on people with disabilities working within the UN system. So it's about I think what Victor put it very mindly. I mean, my personal ethic and the ethic of UN Globe is, who are we leaving out? Who are we leaving out, and who do we need to bring into that room as well? So yeah, that's our driver. Thank you.
Hey, can I come in on that question that Nanu just responded to? There are 2 parts that I just want to, and I also noted in the chat, I wanted to bring in a couple of issues that I saw there that are related to this. So the first thing I'd say is really about the questions around the internal multilateral agency environment. And absolutely, in the years that I've been a part of the multilaterals, I've seen a huge improvement in the attitudes of senior leadership, and certainly in the movement of policies relative to the issue I talked about before around fairness and equality. But the reality is that we do a survey. Within this case, we as World Bank Globe does a survey periodically of staff, asking about this question and trying to get at issues like attitudes towards LGBTIQ colleagues and what our LGBTIQ colleagues themselves think about the environment in the bank. And I can tell you, we still have a long way to go based on the data, based on the surveys. And whereas, just one indicator that I'll note, whereas at headquarter level, for us, that's Washington, D.C., we think a large proportion of people who are LGBTIQ will say on the survey that they're happy to be out at work, and they feel comfortable being out in the office space with their managers, with their colleagues. It's very imbalanced when you look at the folks at the country office. And the country office, of course, whereas we have a diverse workforce in Washington because we draw from all of our member states, including all of our client member states, at the country office level, it's very often we have a higher number of people, a higher proportion from the actual country where the country office is situated. And they tell us that they don't feel as comfortable being out. And part of their concern is, what will it do to my career? So what that says to me is we need to continue to work on the environment in the bank, among our managers and among the colleagues with which we work. And that still needs some positive change. It's heading in that direction, we know, but not quickly enough. And we really need to work hard on that as the bank. The other part I wanted to answer was something on intersectionality. Just to say that in the research that the bank is undertaking, some of our newest research, we're really trying to get at this issue when it comes to data generation and the analytics that will follow at issues of intersectionality. So we're making really specific efforts to reach out to persons with disability who are queer, to provide information, and so that we can get data and begin to give a picture of what this looks like at the intersection of disability and SOGI. We're making very specific efforts to reach out to ethnic minorities in a couple of countries to get a picture of what that looks like for the ethnic minorities, because we don't want to only know what it looks like for gay and bi men in the capital in terms of development outcomes and inclusion or exclusion. we're looking hard to get at issues of poverty. So we're looking at the examples of research that's been done in developed cities in North America and in Europe, in which they asked the question of homeless populations, youth, how they identified, and they found overrepresentation for our community among homeless youth in all of those cities. Between 25 and 40% of homeless youth in developed country cities self-identifying as a sexual or gender minority. So that says that's a proxy for poverty, and that's in developed countries. And so we want to begin to try to understand what that looks like for homeless people or extremely poor people in bank-client countries as well.
Yes, well, as you say, it's still much more work to be done, but thank you both so much for spending some time with us to share what work you have been doing. Probably could talk for another hour or two on this issue, but we have come to our time, but we will continue to cover this at Devex. So again, thank you to our guests, Victor, Clifton, and Gurchatin for their time today, and for all of you, our audience, for your participation and questions. If you are a Devex Pro member, we do have another event coming up on June 30th on the ins and outs of cryptocurrency fundraising. If you're interested in that topic, if you aren't a Pro member, you can sign up for a free trial. But again, thank you to everyone for joining today and for your interest in this important topic, one we will continue to cover. So have a good rest of your day.